Good evening. This is Wayne Parker coming to you live from Baltimore, Maryland. I'd like to introduce you to Mr. Lemuel Louis, Tuskegee Airman, who's one of the original Tuskegee Airmen. What's fascinating to me is Mr. Louis was a pilot, bombardier, navigator, machine gunner, and mechanic. That's amazing to me. Now, I'd like to ask you, Mr. Louis, why were you also the mechanic?
In case you had to land someplace, and maybe something that you could fix without having any extra equipment. Something may have come loose. They would tighten it up.
Now, I understand you were the recent recipient from a bronze medal from President Obama.
Yes, I did.
And I understand it was the bronze medal because they weren't issuing the gold medal.
That's what I understand.
That's amazing to me. That's highest honor I believe one can receive.
As far as I know, it is. The President of the United States.
Yes, and I'm glad I had a chance to look at your medal because I've never really seen one before. So that's remarkable to me. And I understand you were drafted into the Army Air Corps in 1942.
That's correct.
And that was before the Air Force.
That's right.
Now, how many sorties or missions did you fly during World War II?
I actually was in training the entire time. And before I finished training, the war was over, and I signed up to get off of active duty.
I see. And, I wanted to ask you, what happened with that incident in the Jefferson Barrack, Missouri?
In Jefferson Barrack, Missouri, about 13 soldiers froze to death. We were living in tents with coke burners, and if the coke wasn't kept in them all night, it would get cold, it would freeze. And of course, there were about 13 of the soldiers there in basic training that were affected and died as a result of getting too cold.
That's horrifying. And there was a second incident of you were going back to your base?
Well, this was the base at that particular time for basic training.
Okay, but I thought there was another incident. Was there a second incident? No.
I can't think of any now.
Okay, that's quite all right. I also wanted to ask you, did you experience any racism while you were in the Army Corps as a Tuskegee Airman?
Quite a bit of prejudice and segregation. We fought prejudice and segregation on this side of the Atlantic Ocean and the enemy on the other side in Africa and in Europe.
Now, what difference did you see in the attitudes toward race in Europe and the United States?
Well, I didn't get into Europe because it was constantly changing my educational status as far as the military was concerned and in reference to flying. I don't think it was mentioned, but I was also radio operator mechanic. I don't think that was brought out.
Okay. And how did you feel when African Americans were being discriminated against in the United States during World War II? How did that affect you?
I wish that it was something that I could do to stop the prejudice and segregation which has just about disappeared at this particular time.
Also, I understand that most of the Tuskegee Airmen were required to have college degrees.
Well, mostly because I worked with the new men who had come in that had just finished high school. They finished an accelerated college training at Tuskegee in 5 months, and they needed quite a bit of help to get enough information to pass the exam.
And I see where you're highly educated. You have your college degree and you majored in chemistry.
That's correct.
And I understand that you work with chemical warfare.
Yes, I did. Attended chemical warfare school at Eglin Field, Florida.
And what was that experience like in Florida?
We were treated very well at Eglin Field, Florida.
Now, do you remember when Eleanor Roosevelt was taken on a flight by one of the Tuskegee Airmen?
I was there at the time, but I didn't know about it until after it had happened.
And was that by, I believe, Charles Alfred? They called him Chief Anderson Sr.
Correct. That is very correct.
And he was the one that taught everybody how to fly, the Tuskegee Airmen.
Well, he was in charge of flight training.
And I understand that he's going to be on a postage stamp.
I understand the same thing. I don't know too much detail on that, but I do understand he will.
And I saw with the Tuskegee Airmen, they flew over 700 bomber escort missions. And it was the only fighter group to never lose an escorted bomber to enemy fighters.
That is correct.
That's utterly fascinating to me. It's just, that defies the law of averages. I mean, that's just amazing to me. And they said the Tuskegee Airmen destroyed 251 enemy aircraft. And they won more than 850 medals, which, by the way, you have so many medals. It's incredible. Which ones are you the most proud of your medals?
One from the President of the United States, President Obama.
And I understand the First Lady even gave everybody a kiss.
That is correct.
You are the envy of most men, sir. What made you interested in flying?
I've seen airplanes flying overhead all of my life, and I wanted to know what it was like to be able to fly up in the air and be a pilot of the airplane.
And you learned to fly by going in the Army Air Corps?
That's correct.
What went through your mind during wartime? I mean, I always was curious of what goes through a man's mind when he knows that death could be at any time.
Well, I know that people have died for look like no reason at all, be killed in an automobile accident, crossing the street, something like that. They can die most anywhere at any time. But I think you should use your life so that if you do die, you have made some contribution to the human race.
Yes, like your life should have a purpose.
That's correct.
You know, this poster this is the first time I've seen an African American poster like this for World War II. There were always Caucasian men in the posters, and I never knew these posters even existed. You know, I just remembered the second incident, something about you going to jail in Alabama.
Yes, I did. I was coming back to the base. I'd been on leave to go home in South Carolina. And on the back, after we passed the Georgia-Alabama line, there's a rest stop. So everyone, if they wanted to, they could get off and go to the restroom or get something to eat, or they could stay on the bus. I was about the only one left on the bus, and I was the second seat from the back seat in the bus. The bus driver came in and told me to get up and get off the bus and then move on that back seat. I did not do that. So he called the police and had me arrested. And I was arrested for about 10 days before they finally sent a captain up to get my release from the jail. And I went on back to my base.
That was similar to the Rosa Parks.
That's right.
You're a true pioneer all the way around. Mr. Lemuel Louis, he paved the way for the youth. He bridged the gap between the old and the new. He taught the youth to challenge the status quo, to buck the stereotype. He taught young people to travel worldwide, go for their dreams, be international. I had the best interview I've ever had in my life with Mr. Lemuel Louis. He never ceases to amaze me. He was an educator for 28 years, teaching various trades to the youth so they could go out and secure employment. And he encouraged them to further their education, also to launch their own businesses and build their own housing. He's a legend in their own time. I'll never forget him. How long have you been married?
65 years.
To your lovely wife, Miss Reva Louis, who I understand you proposed to her in 3 days.
Correct.
It must have been love at first sight.
It was.
Well, I'd just like to say that this has been an amazing interview for me, and to have the courage of Mr. Louis, I'd have to say is just, it's rare. Thank you very much. What do you want the young people to know about the Tuskegee Airmen?
They fought 3 wars, 1 overseas and 2 at home. The 2 at home, we were fighting prejudice and segregation. Overseas, we were fighting the enemy.
And I'd also like to say that what I've learned also is that you have to pay a price for freedom.
That is correct. The more you know, the better you will do.